In the last video, we talked about the position property in CSS. So in this video, we're going to talk about z-index, which is going to allow us to position elements on the z-axis and allow elements to be above or below other elements. And as you can see, I have the exact same code from the previous video open so that we can use this as an example for how to use z-index. So to get started, let's just apply the z-index property to our child. So we can say z-index, and z-index takes a number. Larger numbers are going to display on top of other elements, and smaller numbers are going to display behind other elements, and everything is based off of a default of essentially 0 for z-index. So if we put -1 as our z-index, you can now see our child is behind our parent element. If we were to change this to 0 by default, you can see that it's showing up on top, just like it was before. And if we change it to a large number, such as 2222, it still is showing up on top because it has the largest z-index. Now, if we go over to our parent, for example, and we set the z-index on our parent to be -2, and we set the z-index on our child to be -1, and save, you can now see our child is going behind our other elements. It's above our parent, because the z-index is higher than -2, but it's going behind element 2 and 3, since those have a z-index of 0 by default. And this is really powerful for when you want to position elements that go behind other elements, in front of other elements. If you want to make a large pop-up that goes over everything, you want to give it a large z-index so that nothing shows up in front of that pop-up, because that would be terrible. And in order to make managing these z-indexes easier, there's an idea called stacking context in CSS, which is fairly complex to understand, so I'm going to break it down into the simplest terms possible. So what a stacking context says is, just like with positioning, when we added position relative, we could absolutely position elements inside of it. With a stacking context, everything inside of a stacking context is all going to use their own z-index hierarchy. This means if we create a modal with its own stacking context, then everything inside that modal is going to use its own z-index in order to determine what order the stacking is going to be for them. So in order to demonstrate this, let's copy this down a second parent element. So we're just going to call this parent2. We'll just add an extra class on there. And if we come down here, you can see that we have our second parent. And let's just add a selector for parent2 and give it a little bit of margin on the top of just 10 pixels. So we get a little bit of separation between our first parent and our second parent. And now what we want to do is we want to make our parents have their own stacking context. And we've already actually done this. And the way we did this is by using a z-index on a positioned element. So essentially, to create a stacking context, what you need to do is use the z-index property on an element that has some form of way of modifying how its children are laid out. So an element that has a position property modifies its children, because if we set the left of this parent to 10 pixels, you can see the parent and all of its children move to the left. So this parent is dictating all of its children's movement outside of the normal document flow. Same thing if we set this parent to display flex. Flexbox uses its own way of laying out its children, so it's kind of its own way of laying things out and makes its own stacking context. Same thing with grid. Grid does not use the normal document flow, so all of its children are dependent upon the grid property of the parent, which is why when you use grid and z-index together, you create your own stacking context. So now if we come inside of here, we go into our parent, we have a stacking context already with this position and this z-index, and let's just set the z-index of parent number 1 is going to be 10, +10, and parent number 2 is going to have a z-index, which is going to be 2. So parent 2 will show up behind parent number 1. And if we come in here and we just set the top to, let's say, -20 pixels, you can see parent 2, let's just make it a little bit larger, -30, parent 2 is behind this parent number 1. As you can see, it's being cut off by parent number 1. But what happens if we were to, for example, make this number 3 child have a really low z-index? So let's say z-index is going to be, for example, let's say 1. This is lower than parent number 2. So 3 should be behind parent 2, right? But if we save, you see 3 is actually on top of parent number 2. And that's because we created the stacking context. This first parent has a stacking context of z-index 10. So everything inside of here is displayed at z-index 10. And then the elements inside the parent, which are these 1, 2, and 3, they have their own stacking context. So their z-index is only affecting themselves and not the actual elements outside of it. This is a fairly confusing topic to think about, but the way that I like to visualize this is when you create a stacking context, you essentially have a piece of paper. And that piece of paper, you can stick other pieces of paper on top of it, but no matter what you do, all the things on that piece of paper are all going to move up and down in the z-axis with that main piece of paper. So if you have a sticky note, for example, which has a z-index of 10, and you put a bunch of other sticky notes on top of that sticky note, that one main sticky note on the bottom still has a z-index of 10, and everything on top of that sticky note all follows that same z-index of 10. So if you have another sticky note off, separate on its own with a z-index of 2, everything on that sticky note with a z-index of 10 is going to show up over top of it, no matter what their own z-indexes are, because their z-indexes on top of that 10 z-index sticky note are all relative to each other. They don't go outside of the stacking context. So that's how we can set a z-index of 1 on this child, which is lower than this parent's 2 z-index, but it still shows up on top because it's stuck inside the stacking context, which has a z-index of 10. So in order to further elaborate my sticky note example, I have 2 pages here. This first one has a z-index of 2, and it's going to have children with a z-index of 50, 30, and 10. Next, I have this page here, which has a z-index of 10 and children of 11, 14, and 12. And each one of these larger pages that you see here represent their own stacking context, which is why when we overlap these elements, what happens is everything inside of positioned 10, with that z-index of 10, everything overlaps the z-index of 2, even though the children of 2 have much larger z-indexes than the children of 10. Since they're both in their own stacking context, it's based on this parent that determines the overlapping for all of the different children. So 10 is going to overlap everything in 2, even though that the children of 2 have a higher z-index. And that's all there is to dealing with stacking context inside of CSS. In the next video, we're going to take a look at one more final way of displaying elements with a different document flow than the normal document flow, and that is going to be the column document flow, which is a really interesting way to make Pinterest-like layouts, so I can't wait to see you in that next video.